be introducing our chairman in a second. Before I get to that, I do want to do a few pieces of housekeeping. Most importantly, the first thing I want to say is thank you to all of our sponsors. We have ATN International, the Inter-American Development Bank with the Americas Business Dialogue. Silver sponsors are Enterprise Florida, Groupe Janvo, Nippon Koi LAC, Port Miami. Bronze sponsors are Copa Airlines, DHL, DRI International, IPSA International, Tropical Shipping. I also want to welcome featured sponsors Bojan, Rum, BMI Research, Global News Matters, JTC Publishing, and Callaloo, who will be doing a live stream this morning, so welcome. And all of our collaborating partners, we're really thrilled that you joined us again this year. And this discussion, as you know, is one of the few opportunities that many of us have to sit and talk about the issues that are of importance to the Caribbean and Central America as they impact economic development in the region. I think for all of us, there's a little bit of an overlay this year. We've just concluded some very interesting elections. It's going to change the way Washington functions for the next couple of years. And I think that is a place that CCA is looking to kind of slide in and see how we can help keep the Caribbean and Central America on the agenda for the next administration. So as a part of these discussions, one of the things that we're looking to do is produce a report that's not just a 40th anniversary report, but it will be an opportunity to share some thoughts about the importance of policy, the impacts of our neighbors in the Caribbean and Central America as we start working with a team that we don't know who they are yet, but we want to make sure that our issues are on top of the radar. From that perspective, one of the things that we do want to do as you go through the next couple of days of discussions, as you start thinking about where things need to go over the next 2 years, we always send out a survey at the end of the conference, and we will do that. But I think this year I also want to encourage you to think about some of the issues that you'd like to see reflected in the report that we put out. So send us your thoughts, send us some ideas, send us the things that you think are important, and we will be sure to incorporate them. I'm not going to take too much time here. I'm just going to be the MC for the next couple of minutes. And so without, one piece of housekeeping for those of you who were wondering, Wi-Fi password, CCAA all caps, very difficult. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Cornelius Pryor Jr. He's the chairman of the board of Caribbean Central American Action. He's a resident of the U.S. Virgin Islands, founder and chairman of the board of directors of Atlantic Tele Network, and has been a valuable part of the CCAA board and structure for quite a few years now. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Neil Pryor.
Thank you, Sally. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's very nice to be here on this 40th anniversary. I remember my introduction to the Caribbean was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard Stadium in 1956, when Fidel Castro came to town and filled the Harvard football stadium. That was what the Caribbean meant to me in those days, and I've stayed with it ever since. I've been living in the Virgin Islands now for 30 years, and I've been a member of CCAA for almost as long, and chairman for something like 10 years. It has been very interesting to see the development of what is going on in the Caribbean and to see the importance that CCAA has played in these developments. We can remember not too long ago when the North American Free Trade Association, NAFTA, was being sponsored by Democrats and Republicans in the United States and welcomed in Mexico and Canada. And today we have both major U.S. parties campaigning against NAFTA. We want to rewrite NAFTA, they've been saying. And of course, CCAA took a major part in the negotiation of the next free trade agreement with Central America and the Dominican Republic, CAFTA, that was a major responsibility and an obligation of CCAA for many years, and we were very successful with that. And we went on to develop and sponsor and help organize and get passed by the U.S. Congress a special exemption in trade for Haiti. So our organization has been very, very active in promoting business and trade between Central America and the Caribbean and the United States. And we're very proud of that tradition after 40 years. It was after Fidel went back to Cuba, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1960s, and then we had the Bay of Pigs. And in 1976, 40 years ago, CCA came out of the Council of the Americas. It was part of the Council of the Americas, which had been around for quite a while. And Sally Yearwood was there then at the birth of CCAA in 1976. So it's very interesting to see how trade has been championed by CCAA since we came out of the Council of the Americas, so to speak, in 1976, and how we have been foremost in that responsibility ever since. And with this new administration, where both parties have taken positions against free trade, I think our responsibility and our importance is growing again. This is going to be a major educational project. We've got to educate the new administration in Washington the value of our third border, the value of the Caribbean and Central America to the United States, and vice versa. So we're very honored that we have with us today two congressmen, one congresswoman, and one congressman, to recognize the distinctions we have these days. And I'm very proud to say that one of the congressional people here today is my own representative from the Virgin Islands, Stacey Plaskett, whom Sally will introduce to you in a moment. But Stacey has been extremely valuable to our telephone business in the Caribbean. She has understood the value of commerce, she understands the value of technology, and we're trying to have this conference today focus on technology and business, particularly the current major issues we have in the Caribbean of banking. The fact of the matter is that the forces in the United States are so concerned about security and money laundering, they have developed protections for the United States that have caused the banks in the region to have major problems. CCA was instrumental in organizing, together with IDB in Washington just a month ago, a major conference on that subject, and we'll be taking that subject up again today. So Sally pointed out to you that we want your suggestions as to what role you think CCA should be playing in the years ahead. And I think we're going to certainly start and continue our efforts with the banking industry, because the banking industry is so important. You can't have commerce, you can't have the development of the private sector if you don't have banking. So I'm very happy to say that that's going to be one of the featured specialties of this conference. So I don't want to take too much more time. I just want to remind everybody that we've come a long way in our 40 years, and we've got another 40 to go, and we are going to continue the fight to integrate the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Before we get to our main speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Manny Mencia. Manny, who is the Senior Vice President of International Trade and Development at Enterprise Florida, probably has also been here for about 40 years. I haven't been here for 40 years. I'm only 30. But without further ado, Manny, as I mentioned, Senior Vice President, International Trade and Business Development at Enterprise Florida, headquartered in Miami, 6 Florida cities as well as several countries around the world, an important friend and partner to CCA over the years, and so it's my pleasure to introduce Manny.
Good morning to you all. On behalf of Governor Rick Scott and the citizens of the state of Florida, I want to extend a very warm welcome to the delegates to the 40th Caribbean and Central American Conference, CCAAs. This is a special event for me, I gotta say. Sally's right. I was an intern at the Florida Department of Commerce when we helped CCAA organize the second conference on the Caribbean and Central America. That was probably back in 1977, so a very special event for me. I want to extend a particular warm welcome to the members of Congress that are honoring us with their presence today, with the distinguished business leaders and government officials from the Caribbean, and to the members of the board of directors of CCAA who do a tremendous job in strengthening the ties between our country and the nations of Central America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean Basin region is of tremendous importance to Florida, both because of our business relationship. We have a business relationship that now exceeds $32 billion. We are, without doubt, the business center, the primary business center of the nations of the region, and the key link between the United States and the nations of Central America and the Caribbean. But we're much more than that. We're part of the Caribbean because so many of our citizens, millions of our citizens, call the Caribbean Basin and Central America our birthplace, including myself, or our ancestral homes. Florida, I believe, has much to offer the Caribbean. We're a state with a vast economy, an economy of $882 billion. To put it in perspective for you, if Florida were an independent nation, it'd be the 16th largest economy in the world, a little larger than the Netherlands, to put it in perspective for you. It's an economy which I think creates a lot of opportunities for your companies, for your exporters. Extremely well diversified and one of the fastest growing in the United States, the fastest growing among the large states of the country. We're a state that combines historical, traditional industries like tourism. Last year, 105 million tourists came to the state of Florida. We're the #1 tourist destination in the world, and we're very proud of that. But we're much more than that. As I said, we combine those traditional industries, tourism, agriculture, with a growing high technology base. I bet many of you don't know that Florida actually has the 3rd largest concentration of high technology companies in the United States. We're also the 3rd largest exporter of high technology. Well, you know, we're the birthplace of the space travel. We were the location where the personal computer was invented, where the laser was developed. So Florida has a great tradition of high technology that sometimes that prowess as a tourist destination hides. We also have a growing manufacturing base of more than 22,000 companies. And I think as important to you, the 2nd largest concentration of international companies in the United States. 90,000 plus companies in this state do international business. In fact, after California, no other state boasts as many companies engaged in international business. I think all of this makes Florida an extremely welcoming environment from companies from all over Central America and the Caribbean Basin. We welcome you to explore opportunities in our state. As Sally said, I'm the guy in charge of international development for the state. I've had the pleasure and honor of doing this for the last 20 years for Florida. Our organization, Enterprise Florida, is the official economic development of the state of Florida. We work for the government, essentially. And we're here to help companies that may have an interest in doing business in our state, whether from the trade side or the investment side. So I wish you a very successful 40th Conference on the Caribbean and Central America, and wish you a wonderful stay in the state of Florida. Thank you for honoring us by choosing Florida once again for this important gathering.
those of you who were with us last year, it was a pleasure to have Representative Plaskett with us. It just brought a lot of energy, just a love of the region, of course, from the position she holds in the Virgin Islands, but also I think an important bridge between the Caribbean, Central America, and the United States. And so I'm very honored and pleased to be able to welcome Representative Plaskett to the podium. She's from the, as I mentioned, U.S. Virgin Islands, and she's African Caribbean attorney who has practiced law in New York and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And her bio is available online, so I'm not going to take too much time. But without further ado, a pleasure and an honor to welcome Stacey Plaskett back to our podium.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I know that you all are focusing on banking and telecommunications, and I thought I would be remiss, however, of trying to weave in what has recently happened in the United States election and its impact on the Caribbean and the region, the Caribbean Basin, Central and South America, and my own thoughts and the thoughts of others about how this will affect your work and your interest in this region. In the past several weeks, I have had tremendous amount of questions, uncertainty by a lot of individuals addressed to myself, to my office, to other members of Congress, and I thought it would be important to discuss that with you all. So I am, of course, always so grateful to be here with you all. This is really home for me, being a part of this group. Neil, Mr. Pryor, it's fantastic always to be in the room with you. He is a great pillar of our community in the United States Virgin Islands, and as the chair of this group, I know that he leads it in a very auspicious way. To the board members, the other dignitaries, of course, to my fellow member, Antonio Colorado, thank you. It's so good to meet you here as well. And just wanted to give you all greetings from the Virgin Islands and from Washington. So I think it's always good to put things in historic perspective as to how we arrived at where we are right now in American politics and what this new administration may hold for the Caribbean Basin. If we just go in recent history back to 2008, after the election of President Barack Obama, he came in a time in Washington when his own party was in fact in power in Congress, in the other branch of government, and which gave him tremendous opportunity and ability to leverage that with the mandate given by the American people, the sense of a new wave and a new regime, to enact enormous amounts of legislative and executive actions. We know that he was able to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices during his time, which allowed for, and most recently, decisions such as the same-sex marriage decision, a tremendous amount of executive orders, which Congress and the Republicans have repudiated in terms of DACA, unprecedented commutations, his push for TPP and TPA in the Congress. During the time that he had the majority, you saw the Affordable Health Care Act was able to be pushed through by the leadership of the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi and others. That in turn, however, did lead to Congress, the Democrats losing power because many moderate Democrats who felt forced to vote for some of these measures to support the Democratic majority. Oh, Anthony, I didn't see you here. Hi, Anthony.
Good morning.
Sorry, just a little side. Got to hail up another fellow Virgin Islander when you see them. So he was able to push through the Affordable Health Care Act, which led to many moderate Democrats having to vote for cap and trade, having to vote for ACA, which in turn led to their demise. In the following election cycle, the Democrats lost the majority, but the Obama administration was able to move that forward. At the same time that you have the Democrats pushing through mandates that they felt were helpful. You saw the rise in the Republican Party at the inauguration of a group of Republicans vowing, making an actual pledge to obstruct any and every attempt that the president would have. This led to a coalition that was formed in the last Congress called the Freedom Caucus, which is a populist, ultra-conservative wing of the Republican caucus in Congress, which as its mandate was able to, and their pledge was simply, to be a part of the caucus, you must vote against the president and vote against John Boehner, who was the moderate Republican willing to compromise with the president and make deals with the Democrats across the aisle. This group, in fact, was able to overthrow Boehner, but it really is a great indicator of a movement that has begun in Washington and outside of the Beltway. Not the Tea Party movement, which many believe is, some great group, but that really does not wield the power that many people inside of the Beltway believe is the group that really moves things. The Freedom Caucus represents 40 to 42 members of Congress on the right who have been able to leverage their numbers because the Speaker then had to shift to the Democrats to be able to make compromises. This group then were able to move Boehner out of his leadership, replace it with Paul Ryan, who was considered a purist in terms of being Republican, but really a policy wonk and an ideologue in a regular Republican fashion. And that group in turn really is a great example of what was going to be filtering out into the rest of the United States. You see then the Republican primary, many candidates, which really is a formula for an outsider to be able to rise up, a really outspoken person to rise up within that group. The rise of the populist wing of the Republican Party, and at the same time a fracturing within the Democratic Party between the progressives and the regulars of the Democratic wing. And that then led to what we have now, which is President-elect Donald Trump. How does that affect many of the issues that this group is concerned with? And what does this mean now moving forward? So you have a president-elect who must, in fact, give support to the group that has given him rise, that being the populist nationalist movement within the American politics. These are hardline immigration, de-emphasizing NATO, rebuilding ties to Russia, removal of aid and really an isolationism and a rebuilding of the American genre. At its extreme is a national identity, what is called identity politics. And you've seen this, and many of you, of course, not just being studies of American politics, but world politics, recognize that this is a movement that's going on across Europe, across parts of South America, and so it's really no surprise to internationalists that Donald Trump would in fact become president of the United States because of the rise of nationalism and identity politics around the world. So now in Washington, I've just recently come back from when we got to Washington after the election, the week after the election, all of the members come back, and the new members are there, and they're kind of glazy-eyed, and they go through their orientation, and the rest of us begin to huddle up and determine who is going to be in leadership. So many of us who are looking for new committee assignments, we prepare our letters, we talk to the people who are the decision makers on what committees they are going to be assigned to. Me, being from the Virgin Islands, follow up all of my meetings with a bottle of rum to each one of those individuals, and trying to jockeying for position not within just committees, but within caucuses, within groups. I'm a member in terms of ethnicity of the Congressional Black Caucus, which in this Congress has grown to 49 members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate. And I'm also ideologically a group of the New Democratic Coalition, which are the moderate Democrats that are pro-business. In many instances, many of them are pro-trade. We believe the base of the Democratic Party will grow through economic development, which raises the tide on all Americans. And so within the Democratic Party, you're seeing fights even among the Congressional Black Caucus, discussions among the Democratic National Committee as to who is going to be the chair of that committee. Should we move towards a progressive, which saw the rise of the millennials, Bernie Sanders, the special interest groups in that respect? Should we move back to the base of working class, blue collar, labor America, the Rust Belt Americans? And shockingly to many, there is even now a discussion and an actual challenge to Leader Nancy Pelosi, who is the second longest serving leader of the Democratic Party in Congress, in the House, which is really a discussion about messaging and direction. Also a rise in terms of youth within the party who believe, because Democrats rely tremendously on seniority for positions within chairmanship and ranking members, that there is no place for younger members to go. So all of that is going on the Democratic side. The Republicans, and interestingly, this Freedom Caucus, which previous administration and the previous Congress had acted as a foil to President Obama and the Democrats, and even the Speaker of the House, is now going to become the foot soldiers, if you would, for the administration to support measures that President-elect Trump has promised to his base that he is going to enact. And that in turn means that will there be a clash? Will there be places of overlap? Will there be mechanisms in place for actual measures to take place? How will that affect Americans? How will that affect the Caribbean? What we have done now is look at what has Mr. Trump said he would be working on in his administration. And I won't even look at the appointees, but what does his actual policies that he said he's going to enact, and using the appointees to determine if in fact that's what he's going to do. Infrastructure. President-elect Trump has said that he would work on a major infrastructure problem. At first blush, this would seem to be something that he and the Democratic Party would be very in sync on. The Democrats have been asking for an actual overhaul in terms of America's transportation systems, pumping billions of dollars into that. However, the mechanisms for the infrastructure project that President-elect Trump and many within the Congress are very different. President-elect Trump has talked, rather than funding projects for infrastructure, which is what the Democratic caucus has requested, he has talked about tax cuts for utilities and the construction sector to incentivize them to do projects on their own, does not believe in massive funding for the project through jobs and other respects, but to give tax breaks to developers and others, which he believes will then cause for an enormous amount of increase in projects. This is something that the Democrats are not in favor of, and you will see a lot of dissension in the House from the Democrats on that, and potential compromises that will need to be worked out in the Senate side, where the vote is 51 to 49 in terms of the party breakdown between the two. The other area, which I'm sure many of you have heard, is the repeals that President-elect Trump has said that he would do, which in conferences and discussions, Speaker Ryan as well as Mitch McConnell have agreed will have to be at the forefront, are the repeal of the Affordable Health Care Act, repeal of climate change initiatives, as well as repeal and dismantling of some trade agreements. This, of course, will impact the Caribbean, particularly climate change, and some of the trade deals that have been put in place, whether that be CAFTA, recent discussions about TPP and TPA, which doesn't have as much impact on the Caribbean, and other trade deals which may come down the line. Tax plan. President-elect Trump has said that he is very interested in doing tax reform. Just so you know, everybody says they're interested in doing tax reform, but nobody actually wants to put pen to paper to it. I sit on one of the caucuses that I'm a very active member on with is a group called No Labels. No Labels is a group of Republicans and Democrats who try to find compromise and find areas in which we can agree on to move some legislation forward. And I sat in rooms 3, 4, 5 hours with individuals from No Labels, and we'll go through childcare, we'll go through labor issues, we'll go through everything. And when we get to tax reform, there is this enormous silence that comes over the entire group. This is the most detailed, most difficult area in Congress for members throughout the spectrum to be able to agree on. And so President-elect Donald Trump has said that this is an area that he will, in fact, be pushing. And what are the things that we believe in tax plan that you might see some movement in? One would be capital gains, loopholes, closures, incentives for tax repatriation is something that the president is really going to be fighting for, which I think there may be consensus on both sides of the aisle that work needs to be done. This will also have ramifications for the Caribbean. So looking at those top areas that the president said he would be working on in the next administration, the next 4 years, how will that affect the Caribbean? Trump has not spoken specifically in any detail about the Caribbean. And how will that then, what are we able to glean in terms of how the Caribbean may be affected by some of his work? So, of course, aid. President Trump has repeatedly discussed the importance of developing countries, non-developing countries, of partners to pay their fair share, for us not to provide the United States and the United States government to reduce its support in areas of aid. That aid being either in security, aid that we give to countries for security, aid for climate change, aid in development. You will see a reduction in that amount. And how will that then affect the relationship of states with one another when those security measures, when support and aid has been reduced? Deportation. There's been enormous talk, and people focus primarily on deportation at the in the Central American borders and the border states with the United States, but the deportation that is being discussed is deportation across the board. And Americans need to be very clear on this, particularly Caribbean people, of what this will mean. We know that the executive order from the president has been extinguished. There's deportation discussion going on right here in Florida with the Haitian community, how that is going to be affecting them. And so areas of DACA and others are something that there will be a tremendous amount of focus on in the first year. And how is that going to affect the Caribbean nations? Those leaders are going to have to be clear about how they are going to interface with the president to manage that deportation. Additionally, banking issues. Mr. Pryor talked about that. There's a discussion in Washington and a tenor that a lot of the banking that's done in the Caribbean is money laundering, is passing through funds for Americans, avoiding taxes. You have seen a request on the part of many members of Congress to provide increased restrictions on banking correspondence. There's been some constriction of banking in the Caribbean because of that, and that's another area that we're going to see some work on. So what can we as Caribbean people, as individuals interested in the Caribbean, Caribbean specialists do in this area? And I think there are two levels of activity that need to take place. One that's internal to the United States. And I've been talking about this for the last year and a half to different Caribbean diaspora groups. It's the rapid organization of the Caribbean diaspora in the United States to become a much more politicized group of individuals. In the past, Caribbeans make up the largest rapid growth, the largest growth sector of Black Americans in the United States. Most conservative estimates put Caribbean Americans at about 4 million. The most generous, almost at 20 million Americans are of Caribbean descent. That is a bloc that can have tremendous impact in policy and in how legislation is passed in Washington, because those groups are concentrated in specific areas. And so that concentration allows them to then leverage that with members of Congress that represent those regions, whether that be Houston, Orlando, Tampa, the Miami area, New York City. There are large groups that are in Connecticut. I was shocked at that during the campaign to see the amount of Caribbean people in Hartford, Connecticut, and other areas like that. Western Massachusetts, and some other areas that one would not think of. So in the past, Caribbean organizations which have been created in the United States have been cultural. They've been about maintaining culture. They've been used in slight ways as economic engines for small businesses and the communities in which they live. They now need to shift that organizational structure that they have to become political organizations, which would then allow them to leverage their numbers to be able to, listen, as a member of Congress, if one person calls me about an issue, you're going to look into it, but you're not going to feel panicked about it. If 100 people call you about it, you will be definitely assigning a legislative assistant to work on it. If you receive 1,000 people calling you about something, you can best believe that legislation is going to be introduced addressing that specific issue, and you will be looking for co-sponsors on the floor of Congress to support that initiative. And so that's an area that Caribbean Americans need to leverage. What do externally those within the Caribbean and you all need to be doing? And I think that is rapid education. We've seen in the last elections throughout the Caribbean absolutely new regimes coming into power. Those individuals are coming to Washington with a clean slate, but also with very little networks in place. When regimes change, quite often in the Caribbean, they will receive transition books. There may be career people that are in the offices that they're taking over, but there are not the relationships. And so these new heads of state and their representatives in Washington and New York need to better leverage the individuals that are in policy positions, whether they be in State Department, whether they be in Congress. There are, in this new Congress, quite a number of Caribbean diaspora members of Congress. Myself, of course, who I will be probably the co-chair of the Caribbean Caucus. You have Yvette Clarke of New York. You have Mia Love on the Republican side, who's of Haitian descent in Utah. You now have my sister Jennifer, who's the new resident commissioner from Puerto Rico, who's also a Republican. Anthony Brown of Maryland, Frederica Wilson here in Florida, Sheila Jackson-Lee in Houston, Carlos Corbello. You have the whole Cuban contingent that is also here in Florida. You have Kamala Harris, who is in the Senate. So these represent individuals in Congress who are ideologically and culturally and ethnically focused on the Caribbean, that need to be leveraged by the representatives who represent all of these other interests within the Caribbean. And there needs to be a rapid education of this new administration. They must be told of how the impact of what these new rules and these new laws will have in the Caribbean. And I don't think they understand the economic impact, not just to the Caribbean region, but to the own interests of the United States. The Caribbean is one of the largest trading partners with the United States. And the United States is woefully unaware of the amount of trade, exports, that come out of the United States into the Caribbean. We know that the region is facing low growth, high debt. Tourist growths have been modest in the last several years. There's a tightening of global regulations in the area. Commodities, while helpful in terms of imports of oil, are also hurting one of the largest and most robust economies in the Caribbean, which is Trinidad. And so we need to have an influx of capital investments. We need to have trade deals that are supportive of the Caribbean interest. And I think that we are in a 6-month period where that message has to be made rapidly, intensely, and almost like a wave on those individuals that we know are going to be coming into this administration, or else the Caribbean is going to be lost. Unfortunately, it's my opinion, in the next couple of years in terms of prioritization by this administration, when the focus comes on Asia as well as in Europe. And so we've got to continue to leverage those things that we have, like the reopening of the Panama Canal, many of the imports that we expect from the United States, and really working in a more concerted effort on that. So that's where I see things happening right now. Sally, I don't know if I can take any questions.
Sure.
I always like to try and take a couple of questions from people. And I know this is a Caribbean group, so I would caution you all not to give statements and diatribes, but actual questions. I know how we like to talk. So if anyone has any questions, thoughts that you'd like me to take back, when I go back up?
Any?
Nothing? Sure. If you could tell me your name and what group you're with?
It's Chris Bennett from the Caribbean Council. You alluded to Cuba in your remarks. Where do you see Cuba going? Whether you didn't mention them in the areas where sort of like Trump might be repealing
That's a great one, and I did not talk about that, and I should have. Thank you very much for that. We know that the normalization that's occurring in Cuba has both benefits and detriments to the other Caribbean islands. And I know from my own area, the U.S. Virgin Islands, while we are figuring out how we create partnerships, we know that the opening of Cuba presents challenges to us, particularly in terms of tourism, in terms of development. How do we manage those challenges of the Cuba market reopening with the benefits, which can be medical and educational partnerships, agricultural partnerships with Cuba moving forward. Donald Trump, President-elect Trump, has made it very clear that he is going to try and tighten and reinstitute restrictions on Cuba. It's yet to be seen whether that was campaign rhetoric as opposed to an actual activity on his part or something that he's working towards. But what I can say, and this is where I would discuss his appointments, throughout the campaign, on my side as well as the Republican side, there was a lot of thoughts that what he was discussing was campaign rhetoric and not actually his beliefs or what he was going to be moving forward with. What we have seen in his appointments is that he meant what he said. And that the things that he put forward as mandates for his presidency are in fact being true by the appointments that he's making, which individuals who line up squarely with the very letter of that rhetoric that he's put forward. So I can only use those appointments in terms of, his national security advisor, his attorney general appointment, not so much his CIA appointment, but his some of the others, to say that in fact he will be moving towards a restricting in terms of Cuba. I know that the response of the Cuban government to the election of Donald Trump is tepid at best in terms of how they received his appointment, his election. And so I can only surmise from that they as well believe that there will be a tightening of relationships once again between Cuba and the United States. Yes?
Geopolitically and socially economic, should there be a strategic increase of relationship between Asia and the Caribbean? Because what I'm thinking is, if the Trump administration see an increased presence of Asia in the Caribbean region, wouldn't that bring more attention on the part of the U.S. to pay attention to the Caribbean?
So the question was, should the Caribbean focus more attention on Asian relationships, which would then signal to President-elect Trump the need for the United States to bring attention to the Caribbean for geopolitical purposes. We know that China, Taiwan, Asian countries do have quite a bit of activity in the Caribbean region. And for us to reach out, meaning Caribbean nations, Caribbean states, to reach out to Asia would be, to me, it's always advisable to have options. But really to ensure that those relationships that we have with China and with others are to the benefit of the Caribbean, and not so much that we're not giving up tremendous leverage in our trade agreements with China. Will that in turn cause President-elect Trump to pivot to the Caribbean? I don't know. I know that he will be tremendously concerned with border protection, and I know in Congress that's something that I'm trying to leverage as a discussion. For the past 4 days, I've had military staff, congressional staff in the Virgin Islands to look at us as a third border. We know the staffers were shocked at the amount of Syrians coming through the Caribbean into the United States, the amount of guns as well as drugs that were coming through. I think that's a point of leverage with the United States and with this Republican administration, to recognize the geopolitical importance of the Caribbean region to the United States as a border protection, as a buffer between South America as well as Asia, particularly with the canal opening and Asian activity that is going to increase in the region. So I don't think that it would be detrimental to us to expand our discussions with China as well as Taiwan. My caution is to ensure that those discussions are to the benefit of the Caribbean. Because as we've seen in West Africa and other places where China has put enormous amount of activity, that it has not always been to the benefit in the long term to those African countries that have opened up themselves to Chinese development.
Thank you.
And
One more?
one last, yes.
Yeah, I'm Taiwan government's representative here in Miami.
as you have
I
visited
felt like that
Taiwan.
wasn't from on high.
You have visited Taiwan last year. Actually, there are a lot of foreign prospective investors from Taiwan. They came to this area. They asked us about general Caribbean situation. And do you have any mechanism, investment promotion mechanism on USVI we can contact so we can better familiarize Taiwan's prospective investors with more information about your climate?
That's a great question, and we can definitely talk offline in depth about that in terms of the U.S. Virgin Islands and investment from Taiwan. But I think his standing up is a great example of Caribbean islands really needing to bring competition between Taiwan, China, the United States, other investors, other developers who are looking for areas who we need to court. We often, as Caribbean islands, accept offerings from outside groups, outside nations, without negotiating to the best possible benefit of the actual Caribbean state itself, because we are in such need of development and we're often forgotten, which is why we have such high debt ratios at this time, which is why we have low growth, I believe, moving forward. So I think that having negotiations not just with China, with Taiwan, with the United States and the United States competitors is to the benefit of Caribbean islands. I know that the Taiwanese government has a tremendous amount of activity in St. Kitts. I talked with the new Prime Minister and his support and beliefs in the Taiwanese government in that. And so I think that it benefits all of us to use leverage those relationships wisely. So again, I want to thank you all. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion this morning, and I'll make myself available